I'm not sure if you're actually recording right now. I'm gonna press stop and we're gonna try again. Okay. I don't know what maybe leave the studio and come back in. Sorry about that. Yeah. Expert. I am thrilled to be joined here by Dr. Elizabeth Weber. And we're covering the topic tonight of off the track thoroughbreds as far as it comes from a veterinary perspective. And I'm really excited to dive into this with you, Dr. Liz. Before I do so, thank you so much for joining us.
You are very welcome.
How is your day going so far? How's your week going? How's your month going?
Well, we have an extra busy week here in Ocala because, in addition to all of our sport horse stuff this time of year, we actually are in the middle of one of the 2-year-old and training thoroughbred sales at OBS, Ocala Breeder Sales. So we are juggling that as well. So we have a number of young thoroughbreds to look at in the next few days.
Wow. How to give us context, how many are you looking at?
Depends on the lists I get. So there are 814 in the catalog. Some certainly, if they're just like not quite right, just having an awkward growth spurt or a bad day or whatever, they may get scratched by their trainers, but they'll likely still sell about 700 of them over a couple of day period.
Wow.
So it will be busy.
That is hard to believe that that's even possible. But I'm all the more grateful that you are taking the time to share your expertise with us today during the middle of that. Um, Before we kind of jump into the topic of off the track thoroughbreds, purchasing off the track thoroughbreds, kind of veterinary implications of that and things to look out for, can you share a bit about your background in veterinary medicine and how you got involved with off the track thoroughbreds?
Yeah, so my background is pretty mixed. I've kind of got a foot in each world. I was an eventer long before I went to vet school, and I rode off the track thoroughbreds. Focused on sports medicine and graduated from vet school and actually went straight to work at the racetrack. Mostly because honestly, it was where a lot of my interests lay. Most of it is sports medicine type work. I love a good thoroughbred for sure. And several years at the track, I left that practice not because I didn't like the work, but because I didn't really want to live in South Florida for the rest of my life. Moved back to Ocala where I'm able to do some of both. So I still do some, thoroughbred and training work and also still do a fair bit or quite a bit of sport horse work. And a lot of that includes off the track thoroughbreds. So I've also galloped racehorses myself for a few years and actually, full disclosure, married a thoroughbred trainer. So we do a lot of both. He actually currently has one in training that is definitely going to be my next 3-day event horse. So we mix it up a lot.
That's awesome. I mean, it honestly feels like you guys have it all figured out. You have it coming from all directions, and the fact that you already have eyes on this horse is going to be a great prospect for you. I mean, seems like a win-win to me. Um, so you've worked extensively with both racehorses and sport horses. Can you talk to us a bit about some of the biggest differences in how the two are managed?
For sure. I think there's a lot of aspects that are different. Some of the more obvious things are feeding and turnout. Most of your thoroughbreds don't get much in the way of turnout. Most of that's logistical. When they're stabled at the track, there might be 1,500 horses on the grounds and, at best 10 round pens because they're in an urban area. So they are not accustomed to being turned out like our sport horses usually get to do at least some of. They're usually on a lot more concentrate when it comes to their feeding program because they're young with high metabolisms and they're performing pretty intense work. Uh, and honestly, just kind of the approach to their training and their careers, we're actually usually ride our sport horses a lot longer. The thoroughbreds, they perform fairly intense work, but they're usually actually trained a lot less time. Uh, Honestly, they think we're crazy that we would go out and condition one for, a 4-star and beyond them for as long as we are. So I think that those are some big differences. The medication different rules are quite different. The racing rules are much more similar to FEI or maybe even stricter rather than USEF. And just the scheduling, with some of the sport horses, obviously, if you're really committed to getting somewhere on a schedule, that definitely factors into your training. But the majority of our sport horses are not necessarily on a schedule that's dictated by their age. Obviously, as we all know, the thoroughbreds, like if you want to go to the Kentucky Derby, you'd have to do it as a 3-year-old. So, not every racehorse is brought along like that, and certainly not everyone is pointing at the Derby, but there's a little bit more focus on age.
Got it. One thing that I've always thought was kind of interesting, and I mean, I would imagine it impacts you a lot as a vet, but correct me if I'm wrong, is just when you're dealing with racehorses, like you're not interacting with I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would guess you're not interacting with like their daily rider. Whereas when you're dealing with a sport horse, like you've got their rider who their hopes and dreams are completely tied to this horse, and there's so much like there's so much emotions there. Is there any like how does that impact you at all on a day to day? Is just
It,
the different relationships that exist within a racehorse kind of equation versus a sport horse equation?
it definitely can. So, with some exceptions, but yes, for the most part, and often the person you're dealing with is in a sport horse context is the horse's actual owner. For the most part, the racehorse owners may not even ride, certainly don't ride that horse, and may or may not be present. You're mostly talking to the trainer. And the trainer, depending on their relationship with the owner, may say, like, okay, hang on, I have to talk to the owner before we, examine this further. But sometimes they're just empowered to call the shots. And like you said, with the sport horses, a lot of the times we have the owner and they may only have that one horse, and like you said, all of their hopes and dreams are tied into what they're doing with that one horse, rather than that horse being one of the ones under their care. Now, the riders, honestly, a lot of the riders want to come and give you their input, especially if it's a horse they like riding or a horse that, is doing very well or that they have a specific complaint about. Because, like we know from sport horses, sometimes you jog a horse up in a straight line on the driveway and they look totally fine. You may still have a performance complaint under saddle. And certainly, like I've honestly, I've gotten on a horse or two and taken them to the racetrack and galloped them to figure out what the problem was because we couldn't replicate it in the barn. So we do get some input from the riders, but it's usually, they're assigned to ride that horse. That's not the horse they're going to take and have a long and extensive competition career with.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. So, when looking at a horse fresh off the track, what are the most important things to consider in a pre purchase exam?
So I think if you're looking at a horse that is fresh off the track, hasn't been restarted, or is still at the racetrack, obviously your pre-purchase ends up being different than a lot of our pre-purchases on horses that have been restarted are, because you're not going to be able to see it under tack. You're maybe not going to have ever tried it, especially if it's still at the racetrack. And you probably need to give it some leeway for a few things. If the horse just raced, hasn't had turnout, might be a little more body sore. One of the biggest things that I always want people to look at, although it's not necessarily always a reason to turn a horse down, is going to be feet on these guys. Um, you know, I think a lot of the trainers at the track have gotten very educated about feet, but there are still, unfortunately, good subset of horses that get shod with. There was an old idea that the longer the toe, the longer the horse's stride is going to be. And, I think we all know that that's not how that works out. In fact, sometimes it just makes the horse sore and then their stride gets very short. Um, but there are still certainly horses that are shod with, too long a toe, too low a heel. And number one, you just want to know what you're getting into and what you're going to need to maybe work on as far as the horse's feet are concerned. And number two, how to help them in there as they transition to a sport horse career. So I think that is going to be one of your big things. There's a lot that you can look at. One of the things that's nice about thoroughbreds is a lot of their history is going to be public and easily accessible. So you can take a look at a horse and you can go and find out, has this horse ever been through, one of the big auctions? Has this horse been through something like this, the OBS sale? If so, how much did they sell for? Who did they go to? And you can look up their race records. So I usually will, if I'm vetting a horse off the track for somebody, I will usually look at these things to get an idea of, basically what's my index of suspicion that this horse has had some injuries. Horses that have been through the sale, number one, will have had a full set of x-rays taken. They're required for the sales. And, if the horse has really good breeding and sold very, very cheap, I think usually you can safely assume there were some x-ray problems. If the horse sold for a good purchase price, usually they vetted just fine. So at least you can know at that point in time, the x-rays were pretty good. It's a good starting point. Looking at their race records and their workout records can give you a hint of, has this horse needed extensive time off? And that can definitely tell you, okay, fine. He was in training, he ran once, and then all of a sudden he kind of fell off the mat for 6 months. And then he came back and they ran him a couple more times. And so that's not to say that that is going to be an injury or a problem that is going to preclude the horse from being able to do the job you want. But it does mean you want to ask some extra questions and try to figure out what happened there, because there are plenty of things that a racehorse might need time off for that would not impact most sport horse careers. Pre-purchasing wise, taking all that information into consideration, one of the things that you do want to be aware of is when they say full set of x-rays for the sale, they don't x-ray feet, neck, or back. So you get your leg joints. You don't get feet, neck, or back. So feet we've already talked about. Neck usually isn't terrible in these young horses, but is always, an important place to check out if clinically they don't look the best. And back, I know obviously this has been discussed to death on many platforms over the last several years, but because nobody really needs to image the back in these guys, and because most of your riders are spending the vast majority of their time, up out of the tack, where the horses might show less signs of pain, even if they do have back abnormalities. I think it's important to at least get a good palpation, and then depending on your level of tolerance for working with any x-ray abnormalities, to take a look there. Uh-oh, you've gone silent on me.
I'm on mute.
Oh, there you go.
It's not my 180th episode.
I thought it was my technology again.
No, that's all me. That's a lot of x-rays to do on an off the track pre-purchase exam. And I think a lot of people would be like, I'm spending it's a lower like starting purchase price than a lot of the horse purchases you would make. But your general opinion is that is the place to really spend and make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. Is that right?
Well, I think joint wise, you can go based off your clinical exam, especially if the horse has been through a sale and you can safely assume they've been x-rayed before.
Mm-hmm.
But feet are kind of, honestly, for any horse, I think, yes, the saying, no foot, no horse, has been around forever. And there's a reason for that. So feet are always on my list. Back, I think it depends a lot on the buyer and their level of tolerance and how the horse palpates. And then, you can take a look at the flexions and, how the horse jogs in general, and potentially their injury history to decide about limb x-rays. Sorry, I have a cat helping now.
Seems appropriate.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a couple of potential red flags, and I want to make sure that we cover all of them. Are there any other specific red flags in a horse's race record that would give you pause when considering them as a sport horse project?
Yeah, so when you are, and this is getting to a little bit of a deep dive, but equibase.com will show you a horse's North American racing record. And not only can you see, okay, the horse raced on this day and finished here, but you can actually open up what they call the chart, which is a bit of a written description of how the race went and, how each horse ran throughout the race. So if a horse didn't finish a race, um, which can happen for many reasons. It can be due to horse injury. It can be due to, you know, like bumped with another horse and the jockey fell off. But that would make me want to investigate, especially if they say that the horse, was put on horse ambulance for any reason, which again could be precautionary. But I think anything like that in a horse's history would make me want to question, the seller extensively about what happened there and make sure that if it was an injury, we have all the, information we need relating to that old injury. Honestly, another red flag is sometimes not enough races. And that's going to sound kind of silly because I think a lot of buyers want a horse that has run less. But some horses, especially with connections with owners that have plenty of money, they'll try them a couple times and say, okay, it's just not talented enough. We don't need to keep trying. Let's find it a career that suits them better. However, if you spend $500,000 on a horse and you run it one time at the highest level of competition you can have for a first timer, and then you say, oh, time to give up and sell them for $5,000. Here you go. Well, then I'm going to ask a couple questions about why horses are like people. Sometimes they get a little overwhelmed the first time and they just need to figure out what it's supposed to be about. And they're a lot better the second time. Maybe they want to race on a different surface or a slightly lower level of competition or a different distance. And if we've tried none of those things to give the horse a chance after spending a considerable amount of money to purchase the horse as a yearling, well, then I'm wondering, like, is there something going on that's making them want to give up sooner? And actually, the last one I had like that had an airway issue, which is why he ran so poorly. But sometimes I will look at those ones that they've really not tried with, and especially if the horse actually did show some ability and they barely tried with the horse, and now they suddenly want to give up on it when it ran well last time. Then I want to know why.
Yeah. I think that's a really good insight because I would totally be that person who would look and be like, "Oh my gosh, it's amazing. They only did 3 races. That's their legs are they didn't do a lot of their legs. It's great." But that's such a key insight there.
Well, and
But
I mean, look, I own one that ran 5 times, but he was absolutely useless. I mean, they tried him 5 times, couple of different tracks, dropped him all the way down to like a pretty low level of competition, and he was useless every time. So I understand giving up on a horse like that. They also did not pay $500,000 for him as a baby, so understandable. But when the factors kind of don't line up for me, then we have some questions.
absolutely. Yeah, it's like a little data experiment or
Mm-hmm.
investigation. Um,
Absolutely.
okay, so continuing on the topic of evaluating an OTTB before purchase, what's your take on the unraced versus war horse debate? Are there advantages to one over the other when selecting a sport horse prospect?
Absolutely. I think like there's advantages to both. Um, I love a good war horse. I'm pretty sure if a horse ran, 95 times, I'm probably not able to break it, eventing. And horses that have had a career like that have run a lot over, several years, those horses usually have a really good work ethic. Those are horses that, they know that they have a job, and like they may have people in the barn that baby them and love them in the barn, but they know that like they're professionals. They have a job. They know how to get their temperature taken and how to, ship to a new place and how to go out and do the job and come back. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Obviously, the unraced, a lot of times that's your horses that either just absolutely show no inclination to do the job in training, or maybe are or bred by a smaller breeder who just stuck them on the back burner for personal reasons and they never quite got there. Or they had a minor injury and the, trainer said, look, it's not showing quite enough ability to do the rehab and bring him back from this and then try again for the races. And I think you can get some very nice horses that way. And obviously they have fewer miles on them. So I've now got a cat howling in the background. My apologies.
Oh,
um,
good.
you've got fewer, you know, nicks and scrapes and wear and tear injuries on those horses that have done less. If they trained, they at least do have a little bit of a base on them as far as fitness and bone and tendon and ligament strengthening and work ethic. Honestly, the ones that have stood in the field until they were like 4 or 5 and done nothing can be either great or can be really difficult because they just don't totally understand why somebody else is going to tell them what to do right now.
Yeah,
So
that makes perfect sense. I think that's totally those are really like reasonable, understandable pros and cons of either scenario. I love the cat ears.
yeah, she doesn't quite want to be in the video, but just
What
her ears.
what's her
Oh,
name?
this is Addison.
Addison. Oh, she's based on the top of her head, she's very beautiful. How do you assess a prospect based on the standard photo and jog video that buyers typically receive? What should people be looking for?
Well, I mean, let's be honest, a lot of times the jog videos are terrible. Whether the horse goes 3.5 steps or is trotting sideways, they can be really tough to assess. Conformationally, certainly I think don't hesitate to ask for a couple more angles. Maybe don't ask them for 27 photos of the left front leg, but I think it's reasonable to say, like, could I get one from the front, the back, and each side? And, if they've disclosed an injury, maybe a close up of that area. The jog videos are tough. Some horses you're better off seeing if they can give you a little clip of the horse training, jogging on the track, where the horse might be more in working mode and less in jumping around mode, especially if the horse just raced and then had 3 days off, which is often about the time they decide that they need to take a jog video because they might retire it. And the horse hasn't been out of the stall. Well, it's been hand walked, but nothing else for 3 days. So they can be very, very challenging. And I think too, you have to consider what the horse has been doing when deciding, how much to write a horse off for looking a bit tight. Because again, the horse that ran a tough race and then has done nothing for 3 days might come out a bit tight. Plenty of 5-star horses come out a bit tight in that scenario, and it's not because they can't be a nice mover, and it's not because they're crippled. It's because they just had a big athletic effort and they haven't really stretched back out of it yet. So I think you get your horses that are beautiful movers in hand no matter what, and can certainly look very attractive even in a bad video. But I think what I'm saying is don't write off the horse that's kind of a mediocre mover, especially if the conformation is there for the horse to be a good athlete.
Totally.
Obviously, if they're limping, like let's start with maybe not going there, but hopefully people aren't sending those videos.
As a baseline, it's a
You'd
good
like
rule
to
of
hope.
thumb. What common things do people try to cover up when selling an off the track thoroughbred, and how can buyers be more aware of them?
So I honestly think that if you're buying directly from the trainers, most of them aren't bothering so much with trying to cover up injuries. I mean, they might downplay them when they tell you about them, but for the most part, the price point for a horse that's retiring off the track into a sport horse career versus the price points for these horses when they're young prospects as racehorses, or even if they are sold as broodmare prospects post racing career, the price point is so wildly different that they're not going to put a ton of time and effort into, say, like injecting something to try to mask an injury. They might say, oh yeah, like that knee is no big deal, in which case, okay, you make sure you have your vet who's doing the pre-purchase look at that knee and decide if they think it's a big deal, because they might not. But they're not going to waste their time and money treating things to try to get the horse sold. If you're talking about somebody who's buying horses direct from the track and then reselling them quickly, I think there's a wide variety. I'll be honest, I haven't met a ton that are going to spend, are going to be injecting a bunch of joints trying to make a horse look better than it is. But they might similarly fail to disclose an old injury or downplay an old injury. And I think some of that is just doing business and trying to get the horses sold, and isn't great. Some of it, I think, comes from concern that buyers will automatically write a horse off because it has any kind of an old injury, when, as we've alluded to before, a lot of them aren't necessarily going to be problematic for a sport horse career. A small bowed tendon does not bother me. If it has a big suspensory branch tear, I probably don't want to buy it for an upper level horse. Lower level horse, sure. But even for an upper level horse, like some minor tendon injuries that are problematic for racing in soft footing and at full speed are really not a huge problem for what most of our OTTB buyers are going to do.
Yeah.
But I think bowed tendon sounds scary to everybody. I mean, understandably.
Yeah. I guess it's just scary to not start with a clean slate, but I think that can be a lot to ask for when we're dealing with athletes. I mean, all of us have, like, none of us have clean slates, so it's a lot to ask of our horses as well.
Correct.
Okay, Amanda is asking a great question in chat. She's wondering, if a horse's chart says that it wouldn't leave the gate, especially more than once, what might that tell you?
So that tells me either the horse had poor early training, or that the horse really doesn't want to participate. And they will specify, there's a pretty big difference between like off slow at the start or even dwelt at the start, which means they were just very slow to get into, to get out and into gear, and a horse that will not leave the gate. Those are rare, but absolutely do happen. And that horse may be electing not to participate because it finds the gate scary, because it's not had the correct training and correct introduction to make it just kind of part of the job, or because it's sore and says, well, this is dumb, I'm not going to participate because it hurts, or it just, for whatever reason, really, really does not want to do that job. I think if a horse does it, say, in its first race and doesn't do it again, okay, fine, but a horse that's repeatedly saying, absolutely not, I don't want to participate. And actually, interestingly, there was a fairly high level, successful, ran in some triple crown races horse a few years back now, that had a reputation for either he absolutely would not load in the gate, and like absolutely would not, they'd have to give up and lead him off the track and scratch him, or he'd probably win. And that horse turned out to have some pretty significant back abnormalities. So I think sometimes they are saying something and people need to be listening.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Ellen is saying, when comparing a 4-year-old warm blood sport horse and a 4-year-old off the track thoroughbred who raced, why do you think we see more medical baggage with the off the track thoroughbred versus the warm blood? Do you think because the off the track thoroughbred started their career younger?
Well, I think most of your warm blood 4-year-olds haven't done a whole lot, period. That being said, I see plenty of 4, 5, and 6-year-old warm bloods with significant soundness issues, whether they're pasture injuries or congenital issues, or honestly, once they've been showing and they're 6, showing related injuries. But yeah, the thoroughbreds have worked harder at that point in their lives than the warm bloods have. So I think you have to expect that they're going to have a bit more going on. If the 4-year-old warm blood is just mostly hung out and maybe been backed, they just haven't had the miles on them yet.
Yeah. Yeah. So some common health concerns and management, if we switch over to some questions related to that, what are some of the most common injuries or issues off the track thoroughbreds come off the track with?
Gastric ulcers. I mean, I think that's kind of a stereotypical one, but certainly, between some of the management things we've already talked about, lack of turnout with friends, high concentrate diet, things that a lot of trainers try to mitigate, but really in the context of the track can't do away with. Between that and then transitioning to a very new lifestyle, certainly it's a bit of a recipe for gastric ulcers. So, gastroscopy is often worth it to see kind of what you're dealing with, how bad, where are they, and make a treatment plan. And then in the meantime, you start transitioning them to turnout and friends and a more forage based diet typically, and try to help some of that along.
And which injuries or conditions are typically career ending for a sport horse, and which ones are manageable? And some of the examples are ossets, bowed tendons, bucked shins.
Don't think I've ever seen a buck shin be an issue for a sport horse. Usually they are not, it's a rare horse, even a racehorse, that can't get over a buck shin with the appropriate time and therapy and return to have a successful racing career. So certainly those I'd be okay with for a sport horse. Bow tendon depends on the severity. More minor tears, juvenile tendonitis. Sometimes those tendons always look thickened, but they never actually had a tear. Those are usually fine for the vast majority of your sport horse careers. If they put an absolutely massive hole in it, then okay, fine. Maybe lower impact career is going to be your go-to. Suspensories always make me a little sketchier. Depends a bit on, again, where they are, how bad they are, what attachments they affect. Ocellates have to be pretty bad, honestly, to affect a sport horse career. I'm not saying they can't be severe enough to affect a sport horse career, but most of them, once they've had time to set, are more of a blemish than anything. Another big one, and I think people get worried about, is anything with quote unquote hardware. If you have a horse that has had a condylar fracture and has had a couple of screws put in an ankle to surgically correct that, there are times when the horse is going to have future complications that may lead to early onset arthritis that may be a problem. And there are some times when, if the joint surface was not disrupted, that horse is unlikely to have any future problems in that joint, even for a return to racing. So I think it's something that is always really alarming when you see it come up on an x-ray, especially if you weren't expecting it. It's not necessarily the end of the world. I'd sooner that than, severe crumbly arthritis.
Got it. Okay. And you touched on this earlier in the conversation, but I want to make sure we round out the topic of feet. So thoroughbreds have a reputation for sensitive feet. What should buyers know about off-track thoroughbred hoof care and shoeing?
So, and I think that it's not entirely undeserved. Certainly in general, thoroughbreds have been bred to be light and not to carry excess weight, and having, a lighter hoof is part of that. There's certainly thoroughbreds out there with great feet. I got one from a client that went to his first horse trials barefoot. The only reason he's got shoes now is because he's an idiot who tried to cut off his foot in the paddock and has pretty good scar there. So, needs it for stability. That being said, there are plenty that come off with sore feet and plenty that have feet that need management. So I think that, like we were talking about, x-rays of the feet to trim them and shoe them appropriately is important, because a lot of them are going to come off with those negative palmar angles, and getting them back into a more normal alignment is great. I think, another big one is we all want to pull the shoes, right? Especially if they're not doing anything. If we're going to give them some time to hang out or grow up or be let down from the racetrack. We want to do the right thing and pull the shoes and let them be barefoot. That's sometimes the right thing. If it's a thin-soled thoroughbred, it is going to be not the right thing because they're going to be crippled. Um, so with those guys, I'd sooner, talk about our options as far as hoof boots to protect the sole, or corrective shoeing if we need to do something with the horse's ankles, or just leaving them in shoes and, giving them good trim and putting some correctly fitted shoes on so that we don't absolutely cripple them and wear away the little bit of sole they have. Outside of that, I don't know that they have anything that's super specific to being thoroughbreds, except for a tendency to be thin-soled, where, in certain situations, pads might be indicated. Certainly keeping on top of moisture levels, like you would with any foot, are going to be important. A lot of racehorses have been taught to stand in a foot tub if they are prone to foot soreness. So it is kind of a useful option to have, that if they are sore, you can stand them in warm water and Epsom salts, or pack them with Magnum paste, and they're probably going to have done it before and be pretty good about it.
Yeah.
That's probably the big thing. It's just knowing what you're working with.
Okay. Super helpful. So you mentioned that ulcers are kind of the most common thing you see coming off the track. What's your advice for managing and treating ulcers in an off the track thoroughbred transitioning to sport horse life?
So once you've done the gastroscope and treat what you have, part of the equation, I think, like, maintaining them and preventing relapse is going to be a little specific to, what your management setup is. But forage, and, on the plus side, one of the things we don't usually struggle with in these guys is, a lot of horses with ulcers, you want to keep forage in front of hay in front of them all the time, but you can't without them getting fat. These guys are a bit less prone to that. So you usually can keep free choice hay or hay and grass in front of them and not have to worry about their weight in that regard. I love alfalfa for these guys. I find, I sometimes have to have the conversation. People are worried it'll make them hot. I usually am, I'm not saying that you won't get a horse that seems to get a little energetic on it, but most of them, honestly, especially if you've cut back their grain compared to what they're used to, really aren't going to get wild just from alfalfa. And most of us don't want to feed our sport horses 12 to 16 pounds of grain a day. Because that really does make them hot. So, making up those calories when the horse is used to having that much intake is important. And alfalfa can be a really good way to do that, and also to buffer the stomach. In particular, we had try to give them, a quarter flake or so kind of right before riding, if they haven't had, continual access to it, to make a mat of that hay on top of the stomach acid to prevent it from splashing up on the walls. There's a number of supplements out there with good research now. There's a million supplements out there, but there's a good handful that do have good research for trying to prevent recurrence of ulcers. Purina's Outlast, the Protect GI, Reline. There are a number that can help manage horses, and then talking with your vet about, should we do anything pharmaceutically if we ship off property for the first time, or have some other new experience that might be particularly stressful.
Great. And then Emily is asking, what are your thoughts on hoof supplements?
So I think that, this is another area that can be kind of hot debate. There are a few that have some data behind them. Most of them don't. One of the biggest things I like to do is make sure that the horse's basic nutritional requirements are fully covered first. So, if we're not feeding a full serving of grain as far as what the bag recommends, which is what the nutritional concentrations are based on, are we feeding a ration balancer to make up the difference? Are we sure the horse is getting a full serving of all the different amino acids and vitamins and minerals in, in each and every day. Because if we don't have the appropriate nutritional building blocks, we're not going to build healthy feet. What we do know from the bit of research into hoof supplementation, biotin is needed to grow a healthy foot, and also, interestingly, copper. There is some good research out there showing that we need copper to grow a healthy foot, and most of your better joint hoof supplements will have some in there. So I'm not averse to adding one, but I think you want to start with making sure all your basic nutritional requirements are met before jumping straight to what we need as a supplement.
Makes perfect sense. So, can we talk a bit about the airway concerns in off the track thoroughbreds and how they might affect a horse's potential for different disciplines?
Absolutely. We obviously do see different airway problems that might inhibit a horse from having a successful racing career, and that might be why they're retiring. There are also some airway surgeries that a horse might have while racing that might have effects down the line or that we might care about. And plenty of them are going to be fine for a sport horse career, but we definitely want to consider what each discipline requires. So, if we are looking for a hunter prospect, we don't want one that's going to make a noise, and obvious airway noise, it's going to be penalized for. If it's going to be an upper level event prospect, we want to make sure that the horse is able to use its airway to its fullest extent and can get a full breath. So kind of our more common problems would be, what we refer to as being a roar, which is having a paralyzed arytenoid cartilage. So the two arytenoid cartilages are responsible for opening the airway. They basically are two nice little flaps that will close when the horse swallows to help protect the airway. And as the horse breathes in, and so especially as they take a full breath, will abduct all the way open so that the maximum amount of air can come into the lungs at any time. And if one of those is not functioning well, and it's usually the left the vast majority of the time, that horse is going to have, a decreased airway diameter. And depending on how non-functional it is, some horses are a little asymmetric or have a mild decrease, and most of those horses have absolutely no athletic compromise. Horses that are nearly or fully paralyzed, number one, can make a noise, and number two, can have some, decreased airway functionality. Those are the horses that might go for what we call a tie back surgery, which literally, exactly like it sounds, ties that cartilage flap into place. But that comes with some future management requirements because the horse can't guard its airway quite as well. So, knowing if a horse has had airway surgery is going to be important. And honestly, an upper airway endoscopy is probably worth it if you have significant upper level aspirations, just to make sure that everything's functioning as it should. And another somewhat common issue is dorsal displacement of the soft palate. We call it flipping their palate. The horse will also sometimes make a noise. It's more of a transient problem though, so it can be harder to diagnose on standing scope. Usually the horse will make a noise when they do it. And interestingly, I see fewer horses that displace during sport horse careers unless they have an underlying stressor. I mean, hey, I scoped a 12-year-old warm blood hunter on pre-purchase a while back because he had enough lower cervical stiffness that when you lunged him in one direction, he became stressed by having to turn his head in the one way and would displace and would make a very audible airway noise, totally fine in the other direction. So I think with those horses, often if you can find and address the underlying problem, you have a lot less of an issue with the displacement. They might still when they get excited or get upset.
Okay. Incredibly helpful. In your experience, how can someone best evaluate a horse's temperament and suitability for eventing, jumpers, hunters or dressage based on their track background?
Tough for sure, because there is, they haven't, other than the galloping, like they haven't really done anything that is applicable to their new career. Um, and a lot of times these horses, if they're being bought straight from the track, might be being bought based off of just video. And as we've discussed, the video is not always the best. So kind of getting a handle on their personality and their aptitude can be tough. I think if you buy from a smaller barn or a barn that's had that horse for a long time, you can get a lot of good insight about, what the horse likes and how they respond to pressure and, what they're like to ride on a day-to-day basis. Certainly the good gallop is important for your eventers. If you can get good video of them training, you might have an idea of how the horse likes to carry themselves, how good of a mover they might be. But a lot of it, honestly, is going to be just looking at them conformationally and the little bit of their attitude that you get to see in those videos, and what you can get from the barn, and kind of crossing your fingers that if it looks like it has all the parts, it'll be able to do the job. And then, being willing to not force a round peg into a square hole. So if the horse really doesn't like the job that you bought it for, once it actually gets a chance to try it out, either you being willing to do a different kind of competition so that you can continue working with that horse, or to be willing to sell that horse into a job that it prefers while you go looking for your next partner. Because I think it's a gamble.
Absolutely. I think that going into it knowing that that outcome is not a failure is important because yeah, sometimes
Yes.
you're not going to have the right horse or the right discipline and that's totally okay as long as they end up where they're happy and you find a horse that makes you happy and I think it all does work out, but I think a lot of people can be really hard on themselves when it doesn't work out, which
I
I think
agree. People can definitely feel like it's because they're not doing a good enough job teaching that horse that job. And it might just really not be what that horse wants to do with its life. And I think that, yeah, like you said, it is still a win if you end up with the right horse and the horse ends up in a job it likes. So
absolutely. Okay, so you mentioned it at the front of this hour that you and your husband are very involved in racehorse resales. Can you walk us through the process of buying an off the track thoroughbred at auction?
so we don't honestly do a lot of resale. I mean, I tend to acquire prospects. He trains racehorses. So we do have a tendency to buy horses at auction that I think would make good eventers if they stopped wanting to be racehorses or turned out to not want to be racehorses. It's probably, and I'm also probably the reason we have 80% fillies. I'm definitely a mare person, but when we're picking them out at auction, it's not entirely different from picking out a sport horse prospect, really. We're looking for what is that horse's expression? How does it come out? Is it spooking at everything in sight and kind of nervous about everything, or does that horse come out and kind of look around at the world and go, yeah, that's fine, I'm going to walk over there, I got this under control. We like that attitude where they kind of want saying they want you to let them at the world. um and honestly, for all that we're saying you don't get to see much of them when you're buying them off the track, you really don't get to see them do a ton necessarily buying them at auction, especially as yearlings. You get to see them walk, and that's about it. You can have your vet look at the x-rays and the upper airway scope and palpate legs, but from a actual clinical perspective, like, you're mostly watching them walk. So we look at them for confirmation. We want them to have confirmation that suggests they're going to stay sound. We want them to have decent feet, and we want them to have a body that kind of all works together. Do they, when they are walking, are they striding out and swinging through their top line versus more short strided and hitting the ground hard? So it's pretty similar, but we definitely bought one a little over a year ago that is slated to be my next event horse if she does not, well, when she's done running or if she doesn't want to run. So we'll see.
That's so exciting. I love that. Everyone stay tuned for that one. Okay, so if someone is new to buying an off the track thoroughbred, what's your biggest piece of advice for making the right choice?
Work with a trainer or somebody who has worked with off track thoroughbreds before, because they're used to a different kind of handling. You know, they are used to being in a professional program, a routine every day, handled by professionals. And that has its pluses and its minuses. You know, if you go to take that horse's temperature, it's probably had that done every single day for the last, year, and it's not going to get very upset about it or very offended. But also, if you try to like ground tie them from day one or have a kid on their phone holding it, like, they're fit and they are used to kind of going and doing things. So I think that having a trainer who wants to work with you and you're off the track thoroughbred is important, and who's familiar with thoroughbreds, and also who can help guide you through the process of selecting one with this kind of limited window you get to look at their soundness and their abilities and their attitude. So some experienced advice is definitely, like most things, definitely the way to go.
I totally agree with that. Is there anything else you wish more people knew about off the track thoroughbreds as sport horse prospects? Anything we didn't cover today? Anything I forgot to ask? This is the time to think
Um,
of that.
I guess so the two biggest misconceptions I probably run into are the idea that these horses like come off the track and they're quote unquote not broke. Um, they're a different kind of broke, depending on what barn they've come from. They may or may have not have been taught to move off the leg. They may or may not, you know, put themselves in a lovely frame when they set off. They are definitely used to rein pressure, meaning a different thing. If you pick your hands up and pull while they're galloping, they are going to go faster. Um, but they probably have lead changes if you know how to ask for them. And they are used to being ridden on a daily basis. And it's kind of just learning how to take the buttons they have and translate them into the buttons you want. The other big thing I think is still the medication thing. You know, the racehorse industry has a bad public perception. Certainly, some of it has been deserved. Some of it is really not. But the idea that all these horses, if they drop a bunch of weight when they come off the racetrack, it's because they're coming off the steroids, hasn't been true for a couple of decades. You know, anabolic steroids are not permitted. They're very not permitted. And the medication withdrawal times are quite strict. You know, in the vast majority of US racing jurisdictions, a single dose of bute is a 48-hour withdrawal, which when you compare to USEF, which will let you, give a gram of bute morning and night, is pretty different. A single dose of dexamethasone is a 4-day withdrawal. You can give it the night before for USEF. And one isn't necessarily better than the other, but there's pretty strict medication rules and pretty strict penalties for overages or positives. And so these horses are not getting a lot of medication, which I think is very much different from what the public perception is. So I think that sometimes they come off the track and they are getting less grain because they don't need this much grain anymore. But if you take a horse from 12 to 16 pounds of grain a day to 2, yes, they might lose weight in top line, and it's not necessarily because they were on some really spectacular drugs before and now they're not.
Yeah. Amanda is asking, are there any kind of conformation abnormalities that are absolute deal breakers for you, especially if the horse is headed for a sport career?
I mean, we all have our things that we really don't like. I get twitchy about horses that are super straight through the hock and the stifle. Um, certainly hind limb, high suspensory injuries aren't a super common racehorse injury, but they are quite a common sport horse injury. And those horses that are really straight through the hock and kind of low in the fetlocks tend to set themselves up for that. So, not my favorite. I'm not saying they can't stay sound, but it makes me a little twingy. Forelimb conformation, a few degrees of anything is usually acceptable for the most part. If they're a little toed out, I prefer that to being a little toed in. That being said, my personal horse is in fact toed in both fronts and does just fine. Other than the fact that he looks like he's swimming when he gallops at you, which is probably part of the reason he was such a terrible racehorse. But anything that's not extreme is usually going to be fairly okay. Really asymmetric front feet can be another one of the things that I will pick on. Certainly, there are plenty of horses with asymmetric forefeet, even club feet, that are able to successfully have a career. I always want to look a little harder at those horses and say, okay, is this how you were born, or is this because you've been chronically weight bearing asymmetrically because something is bothering you? Are you more upright on this foot because you've chronically only been putting 49% of your weight on it because something else in that leg hurts? So I do always want to take a little bit of a look at those horses and be a little extra critical of them to try to decide if we need to worry about that or if that's just how that horse is put together and seems to handle it fine and it's going to be okay.
Super helpful. Well, Dr. Liz, I can't believe it, but we're already here on the end of the hour. I cannot thank you enough for your absolute, such actionable and clear takeaways from this time. So I really appreciate that. And I hope we can have you back again because I know that there's so much more of your expertise that we would love to learn from. Everyone who submitted your questions, who attended the live and submitted questions, thank you guys for doing so. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. And Dr. Liz, I hope you have a great time at the auction this week.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we'll see you guys next week and talk to you later. Have a good night, everyone. Bye. Okay. I think you are almost fully uploaded. Looks you're about 79%, 80%. So it says it's about 10 seconds until upload. If that
trying.
takes a little bit longer sometimes for people, maybe